Well, good evening. I'm Alan Jackson, and welcome back to Nashville. One of the great philosophers wrote that those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. Well, my question tonight is, are we in one of those moments now? I'm thinking of all the challenges President Trump is facing and how similar they are to when Ronald Reagan was president. The slow economic growth, stagflation, unemployment, big government spending, too many regulations slowing business growth. The Soviet Union had invaded Afghanistan. American hostages had just been released, but the U.S. had been humiliated by Iran for more than a year. House Democrats, they were doing everything they could to push back on Reagan's agenda. And this one too, a crazy young man tried to assassinate him. Does all that sound familiar? Well, that was more than 40 years ago. So is this a historic repeat, or are we going to work together and insist on change? Well, to help answer that question, we've invited back a political insider who has a unique window into then and now. He was the political director in the Reagan White House. Jeffrey Lord, welcome back to our show.
Good to be here, Alan. Happy spring, I hope.
Absolutely. It's time for the daffodils and the tulips to be up. It's very early in the new president's term, but we're beginning to see the forces of the deep state that pushed back on Reagan. Now they're pushing back on President Trump. I know that your old boss didn't just sit by and let it happen, and you can see President Trump is not taking no for an answer. So how do you think he's doing?
Well, one of the things I've noticed, I have had the privilege of being in the Oval Office with President Trump on occasion, but I noticed that fairly recently, he has added President Reagan's official portrait in the Oval Office. Can't miss. It's right to the left of the Resolute desk there. And I thought, wow, what a way to send yourself a message if you're sitting in that chair. As we would say in the Reagan White House, what would Reagan do? And I know from conversations with him, when he first ran, I would compare him a lot to President Reagan. And he became quite amused by all this, then finally started to talk about it at rallies. He'd introduce me and says, he always compares me to Ronald Reagan. He'd pause and say, that's not so bad, is it? And the whole place would go crazy. Yeah, there are a lot of things that's similar. History repeats itself on occasion. And what would you expect from Russia other than the kind of turmoil that we've got going? And President Reagan used to joke he was being criticized for not meeting with the leaders of the Soviet Union, to which his response was, "Well, they keep dying on me," which was true, because they had one old leader, Brezhnev, and there were a couple others in there, and they would serve a little time. Brezhnev was at the end of his rope, frankly, by the time Reagan came in, but then there were others who replaced him, and they didn't last very, very long. And finally, it was Mikhail Gorbachev, and Margaret Thatcher had a meeting with him, and she and President Reagan were sort of soulmates. And she said, "I think we can do business," and it turned out they could. And by the time and it's very interesting in terms of the way Reagan dealt with this sort of thing. I remember I was in the political office, and so among our responsibilities in the fall of 1986 was sending President Reagan around the country to campaign for Republican candidates. All of a sudden, we get word that Gorbachev wants to have an immediate summit on the reduction of nuclear weapons in, of all places, Reykjavik, Iceland. Well, we're thinking, oh, please, no, don't make us stop. President Reagan insisted they stop. He flies to Iceland. They meet in this old sort of like wooden schoolhouse type building. They're making negotiations out of the blue on reducing nuclear weapons. They're making real progress. Reagan is very happy. He thinks they've got a deal. And all of a sudden, out of this, Gorbachev says, "But, Mr. President, you have to reduce the growth and the research into the Strategic Defense Initiative," which was a major Reagan thing. Well, Reagan would have none of it. And Gorbachev insisted. And with that, remembering that Ronald Reagan was a labor negotiator back in the day, he looked at his Secretary of State, George Shultz, who was sitting next to him, slapped his hand on the table and said, "Let's go, George." Got up from the table and they walked out. And Gorbachev comes scampering around the table And I got this account. Some of you could see in the news, but people who were in the room told me that he comes scampering around. And so you see these pictures today of the two of them coming down the steps of this schoolhouse or whatever. Reagan does not look happy. They get to the bottom. The limousine is there to take Reagan back to Air Force One. And Gorbachev puts his hand out and says, I don't know what more I could have done. To which Reagan snaps, you could have said yes, gets in the car and hightails it off. Now, the PS to all of this is a year later in December, and I was there for this, into the White House comes Mikhail Gorbachev to sign an agreement that he has now agreed to reducing nuclear weapons. It was quite the deal. And Reagan kidded him and he says, I'm going to say one thing that I know you're tired of my saying, Mr. Chairman. And Reagan, of course, did not speak Russian, but he tried. And the saying was, Doverai no provii, which he said for all the rest of us means trust but verify. So it was quite the deal. And I see some of that going on, listening to this business about the phone call today with Putin and Trump. They have a relationship and they know the tremendous responsibility they've got. So I think that helps.
Well, you know, as much as the Democrats are pushing back, so too is the media. But Trump is pushing back because he clearly knows what he wants to achieve, just as President Reagan did. Do you remember how he laid it out in his inaugural address? Let's listen to how he had believed in the unique strength of the United States.
If we look to the answer as to why for so many years we achieved so much, prospered as no other people on earth, it was because here in this land we unleashed the energy and individual genius of man to a greater extent than has ever been done before. Freedom and the dignity of the individual have been more available and assured here than in any other place on earth.
Do you agree that both Reagan and Trump harnessed the power of the American people and changed the trajectory of the country?
Amen. And, you know, having both worked for President Reagan and traveled around with him a little bit and all this, and now having been to my fair share of Trump rallies, you can see it. And I get, you know, because I get on television, people come up to me and talk and they volunteer their stories. Well, I hadn't been into politics or I hadn't done this or I hadn't done that. But now, boy, I'm so enthused and now I want to do whatever I can to help. That is unleashing the energy of the American people. And boy, it's all to the good.
Well, Jeffrey, please stay with us for another segment. There's a lot more to talk about. We'll be right back after this break. We're back now with Jeffrey Lord. And I'd like to ask you now about how the tone has changed since the Reagan years. You know, any honest person would have to agree that there's billions, if not trillions of waste in government. So Trump brought in one of the world's most successful businessmen to help figure out how to fix it. But it's clear that some Democrats are never going to help. Listen to this.
Here in Washington, driving to work for the last time in my Tesla. When I bought this thing, I didn't think it was going to become a political issue. Every time I get in this car in the last 60 days or so, it reminds me of just how much damage Elon Musk and Donald Trump is doing to our country. There are some things I really liked about it. There are things I didn't like about it, but that doesn't matter. What matters is, doing the right thing. I think it's time to get rid of it.
Well, the senator is a former astronaut and captain in the Navy, Jeffrey. Shouldn't we expect more from him than pouting about the Tesla he drives?
Yeah, I would think so. This kind of thing, to go back to Reagan, in Reagan days, he appointed a young congressman from Michigan named David Stockman to be his director of the Office of Management and Budget. And very much, and I've written about this now, very much like Elon Musk, Dave Stockman was going through Washington with a swath, going in all these programs, cutting them out. He terrified the bureaucrats of Washington, D.C. in the day. That's what you've got going on right now. And the very fact that Mark Kelly, of all people, feels compelled to do this says a lot, that he has become part of the establishment there. That's who he has become. and God bless them. But if we're ever going to have the ability to send people into space and explore the universe and all this, you can't be broke. And if we keep going down the path we're going, this country is going to be broke, and it's not going to be a happy time for Americans.
Well, President Trump is also trying to level the playing field with Mexico, Canada, China, and Europe. There seems to be no understanding that American companies have been put out of business by foreign tariffs on our products. And Mr. Trump is simply trying to help the American people. But the legacy media only reports on the angry Canadian politicians. If they're not interested in journalism, whose side is it they're on?
Yeah, well, they're on the establishment side. That's the deal. I mean, this is the thing that really gets to me. They start with the premise that they don't like Donald Trump, and then everything else flows from there. And it doesn't make any difference, as I think President Trump has said in some form himself, if he cured cancer tomorrow, they would still find a reason to be upset with him. And, that's a pretty sad deal. But the American media has become very much of a leftist club. And you can see it manifest itself. There were headlines in the recent days that Caroline Leavitt was not going to attend the White House Correspondents' Dinner or the Gridiron Dinner, these sort of Washington institutions. And I guess it's the Correspondents' Dinner, and I've been to a couple of them, where they stand up and they raise a glass and say, "To the President of the United States." For the first time in 140 years, they stopped doing it. What about that?
When Reagan left office, the total federal debt was $2.8 trillion. Since then, $33 trillion more has been added to it. That means that every man, woman, and child in this country has $110,000 of federal debt. In terms of history not repeating itself, the perfect storm that brought down the Roman Empire wasn't just political and social, it was financial. Sounds all too familiar to us, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. You can't see it, but up here I have the 7 volumes of the rise and fall of the Roman Empire. And, I am a big believer in history, in studying history, and learning history, because history does, in fact, repeat itself for the obvious reason we're all human beings here. And human beings tend to do things in patterns, even if they don't know the history. And that's what you have to be very, very careful about. So for those people who have read history, they should understand what the red flags are that we're seeing along the way and make sure that we don't follow down the same path all over again.
Reagan simply tried to cut the number of people on food stamps, and he was accused of driving poverty across the country. Of course, the accusers were the liberal media and certain Democrats who counted on the giveaways for their political life. That sounds pretty familiar too, doesn't it?
Boy, does it ever. And, and I'm convinced a lot of these people, they don't read history. They don't know. And the central premise here with these folks is that government has to be massive and spending millions and millions and millions of dollars. And you find out some of the things that the government has been spending money on. When I first moved to Washington, I was working for a congressman who was on the House Budget Committee, and Reagan had just taken office and was putting out his budgets, which were huge things, running the United States government. And it was all about the cuts he was making in those budgets. Well, it was my job to go through this thing with a fine pen and circle things so the congressman would know. And it was stunning, the amount of stuff, and I use that word advisedly, that was in these budgets. And the thing that particularly got to me was a lot of them were put there by Republican members of Congress. So that having all this money spent was very much of a bipartisan thing. And that is a real problem here, because you get, don't cut me, don't cut thee, cut the guy behind the tree kind of philosophy.
Well, one final question. As a longtime political director, do you think President Trump can keep enough of his current power with the House and Senate after a 2-year window leading up to the midterms? Or put another way, will the majority of Americans who got behind him last November stay with him and even grow their base by 26 and 2028?
That's a very good question, Alan, because what's going to happen here, just historically, presidents start at the very top in terms of their power and authority and popularity. And then ever so slightly, it starts to go downward. So the optimum moment for, in this case, President Trump is now, is right now. He's got the House, he's got the Senate, he's got the polls and all of that kind of thing. Over time, some of that will start to evaporate. That's just sort of the law of political nature. And his ability to get things done will lessen. So now is the time. And I have to say, I think he knows that. I'm sure he knows that.
Well, Jeffrey Lord, it is always a pleasure to have you on. Please stay in touch.
You bet. Will do.
When we come back, some thoughts of my own. There is hope, believe me. I believe the election last November was an episode of shaking in our nation. Things hidden, corruption, improprieties in our government, they're being exposed daily. Too many times politicians have only promised change, but we now have a president that is following through on the promises that the nation voted for. I applaud that. As it turns out, the implementation of the policies that voters supported has disrupted the status quo. Things are becoming visible in the judicial system that weren't visible before. Judges are single-handedly opposing efforts to deport criminal cartel members who are in this country illegally. Some are rushing to the defense of instigators of violent anti-Semitic protest on college campuses, while others are trying to force the administration to provide financial aid overseas toward efforts that most voters don't condone. Some judges have tried to block biological males in women's prisons from returning to men's prison facilities, and they ruled that prisons cannot hold continuing medical hormonal treatments from these biological males. Well, there's a passage in Isaiah that is a pretty accurate description of the world we're seeing today. It's Isaiah 59. It says, "Justice is driven back and righteousness stands at a distance. Truth has stumbled in the streets and honesty cannot enter." There are loud, powerful voices that want to tell us there's more justice absent a biblical worldview. It's a lie. When the truth stumbles in the streets, justice is diminished. The more broadly a biblical worldview is incorporated and embraced in our society, the more justice will prevail. And if we'll believe that, it will bring hope and not despair, I promise. We'll be back in just a moment with your emails. Thank you so much for taking the time to send your emails. I always enjoy reading them, and some we get to share on the air. Gladys Hicks emailed, "Pastor Allen, I've been listening to your sermons for years," which obviously means they're very inspiring. "I appreciate that you not only teach truth, but because God initiated governments, it blesses my heart to hear from a spiritual perspective the direction leaders are taking us. So bless your heart for sharing that with us." Well, Gladys, I grew up in the South. Bless your heart can come with many meanings, but I'll take it as a real blessing. Ruth W. emailed, "Pastor Allen, I watch your ministries every day and Wednesday and Saturday too, but I really like this new show. I've learned so much about how to watch and listen to the news media lately. Now when I see the news at night, my first thought is, why are they lying? I don't believe anything the media says, shows, or demonstrates anymore. I want to thank you and your crew for this tremendous opportunity to actually get to the truth again. God bless you and your ministry. You're in my daily prayers." Well, Ruth, prayers are appreciated every day. As we finish the show with your emails, I want to take just a moment and share my thoughts on the news about the end of the ceasefire between Israel and Hamas. If you've watched this show before, the chances are that you've heard me talk about many years in Israel and the challenge that the Israeli Prime Minister has had in trying to rescue the hostages, while also putting an end to the terrorism inflicted on the Israeli people. Well, Hamas has demonstrated once again that they can't be trusted as a partner in peace. They haven't released the hostages. There's dozens of hostages still held. We're over a year and a half since that horrible day in October when the attack was launched. The Israelis have resumed the war. The bombs are falling in Gaza. I think the best response we can have here at home is to pray. Pray for the hostages. Pray for the leaders in Israel. Pray that somehow God will intervene. I believe only the Prince of Peace can bring peace to that troubled place in the world. I believe Mr. Trump's acknowledgement that the policies of Gaza have failed are true, and we're going to have a new solution. We cannot refund Hamas and set the people of Gaza up for another chapter of destruction, death, and suffering. I believe our prayers, they hold the future. Make sure you send your emails to comments@alanjacksonnow.com. And from all of us here in Nashville, I want to thank you for joining us tonight. And I pray you have a wonderful evening.